which is exactly our mission for this deep dive today. We are examining official environmental policies.
Because the contrast there is wild.
It really is. Specifically, we're looking at the strict, sweeping words of European Union environmental law, and we're contrasting those pristine legislative promises with the highly comical, deeply flawed, and frequently tragic reality of how those laws are actually executed.
Right. Executed by local municipalities on the ground. And to unpack this whole clash between utopian law and bizarre reality, we're relying on a very specific set of source materials. We have two incredibly sharp guides for this journey.
Yes, Kesser and Steen.
Yeah, these two are great. They're two 11-year-old boys living in Denmark, studying in Professor Hendrix's Nature and Innovation class. And through their local ground-level explorations in their neighborhood, we get to see what these grand ecological promises actually look like.
When you strip away all the bureaucratic jargon.
Exactly, when you just look under the dirt.
You know, children really make the perfect empirical scientists in this context.
Oh, totally. Because they don't buy into the spin.
Right. They haven't yet been trained by society to accept bureaucratic doublespeak. I mean, if an adult city planner looks at an official zoning map that declares a muddy ditch a protected wildlife corridor, the adult nods and accepts the legal fiction.
Yeah, they see the stamp of approval and say, well, the paperwork says it's a corridor.
But an 11-year-old like Steen or Kesser, they actually walk down to that ditch, turn over a rock, and note that the space is completely devoid of life. It's just filled with construction trash. They operate entirely on physical evidence.
Not legal declarations. And the tone for what we're about to uncover is set perfectly by Steen's dad in the source text. He looks at how his local government handles nature and describes it as a mix of Chinese New Year, like just complete, unpredictable, explosive chaos and Russian roulette.
That is a phenomenal description.
Isn't it? You simply never know when the hammer's going to drop on a local ecosystem, or what bizarre excuse the town council will use to justify it. So if you're listening to this on your commute or walking through your own neighborhood, I want you to think about your own local government.
Keep them in mind as we go through this.
Think about those fancy press releases your city puts out about their new eco-friendly infrastructure. Prepare to view those claims through the deeply skeptical, observant eyes of a couple of smart kids. So let's jump right in.
Let's start with what happens when a local town council runs headfirst into international law. We're traveling to Sjællands Odde, Denmark, back in August 2022.
So what's the setup here?
This specific case revolves around a ferry road expansion project. It's a classic municipal scenario. A town needs to expand infrastructure, and in this instance, widening the road leading to a major ferry terminal.
Which is a huge deal for a town.
Oh, massive. The project is driven by logistics, traffic flow, and most importantly, regional economics. But as with almost all major earth-moving projects in the European Union today, the bulldozers hit a profound legal roadblock, or rather a biological one.
Right, the local sand lizards.
Specifically, the Lacerta agilis, or the sand lizard. Now, these are not just your average garden lizards. Under European law, they are classified under Annex 4 of the EU Habitats Directive.
Annex 4, which is like the VIP list, right?
Essentially, yes. For anyone unfamiliar with the intricacies of European environmental law, Annex 4 is the VIP list of wildlife conservation. Species listed on there require strict, uncompromising protection regimes across their entire natural range within the EU.
So you can't just politely ask them to move.
No, the legal wording is incredibly robust. You cannot deliberately capture them, kill them, disturb them, or destroy their breeding sites or resting places. It acts as an incredibly powerful legal shield against development.
Okay, so you have a massive multi-million-dollar road expansion, a project the town desperately wants about to bulldoze right through the VIP lounge of protected European reptiles.
Yes.
I would assume a law that twists and plum means the project just gets canceled, right? I mean, if you cannot disturb the resting place, you surely cannot pave a highway over it.
Well, that is how the law reads on the billboard, but the drive-through reality of municipal planning is entirely different.
Here we go. The squished burger.
Exactly. The authorities realize they cannot just pave over the lizards without triggering massive lawsuits and fines from the EU. So they execute a mitigation plan. They apply for a dispensation to move the protected species.
And the gap between the strict Annex 4 protection regime and the physical reality of this mitigation plan is just mind-boggling. First of all, to move these highly protected, internationally recognized VIP lizards, The local authorities captured them and stuffed them into an IKEA plastic box.
The visual irony is just profound.
It really is. You have the absolute pinnacle of European environmental legislation being physically executed using flat-pack Swedish home storage solutions.
It's absurd.
You picture a team of elite biologists arriving with specialized climate-controlled biocontainment units, carefully monitoring the heart rates of these rare animals.
Yeah.
But no, they grab 20 sand lizards, chuck them in an IKEA tub with a snap-on lid, and immediately pivot to their grand public relations spin.
Because they have to sell it to the public.
Exactly. They told the public and the local media that these 20 lizards were not being evicted. No, they were being relocated to a luxury hotel.
The phrasing there is deeply manipulative.
Oh, completely.
By labeling the relocation site a luxury hotel, the project managers and local politicians instantly absolve themselves of any environmental guilt. They completely reframe the narrative.
Right. They aren't destroying an ancient, naturally evolved ecosystem.
No, they're supposedly acting as benevolent landlords, upgrading the lifestyle of the local wildlife. The stated plan was that these 20 relocated lizards would breed in their new luxury accommodations, and a year later, their 50 anticipated offspring would be released back into a similar environment in Nader Park, Linus.
Which happens to be right near the local woods Kesser and Steen explore, the Hubjörgsskoven.
Exactly.
But the corporate press around this was astonishing. I mean, the communications chief for the ferry company actually told the media he had wet eyes while talking about this relocation project. He was literally crying.
Wet eyes, yes.
But when you look at the underlying data in the sources, it becomes hilariously clear why he was tearing up. And I promise you, it wasn't because he was overwhelmed by the breathtaking majesty of a sand lizard adjusting to its new habitat.
No, the tears were undeniably financial. Let's look at the underlying economics of municipal mitigation. The source text notes that constructing this brand new lizard habitat, the supposed luxury hotel, costs the ferry company 500,000 Danish kroner.
500,000. And what did they get for that?
A mere 2,500 square meters of land.
Which is nothing. If you do the math on the local real estate in that area, that is an astronomical sum for a tiny patch of dirt. In the Linus area, a standard 700 square meter residential building plot easily goes for 1 million kroner.
So they were paying premium rates.
Massive premium. Essentially buying prime real estate rates for a 2,500 square meter sanctuary, simply to satisfy the bureaucratic box checking of the Annex 4 registration. The communications chief wasn't crying over nature, he was crying over a corporate budget taking a massive hit for a compliance exercise.
Exactly. And the rhetoric from the people running the biological side of the project matched the corporate arrogance.
Oh yeah, the zookeeper quote.
Right. We have a direct quote from the zookeeper who acted as the project manager for this relocation. He stated, "If you build a project, the species must be better off after than before."
Okay, wait. I want to challenge that for a second.
Yeah.
Because humans engineer better environments for ourselves all the time, right?
Sure, we do.
We build climate-controlled houses, we filter our water, we build incredible immersive zoo enclosures for animals. Why is it so arrogant to assume a well-funded project manager could actually build a better habitat for a lizard than just a random patch of scrubland next to a ferry terminal?
Well, it's a fair question, but it fundamentally misunderstands the difference between a closed system zoo and an open system ecosystem.
Okay, unpack that.
A zoo enclosure is completely controlled, right? Food is delivered, predators are excluded, temperature is regulated. But in the wild, an ecosystem is a delicate, chaotic web of millions of interacting variables. You've got soil pH, specific insect populations, microclimates created by specific plant shadows, subterranean moisture gradients.
It's infinitely complex.
Exactly. The technocratic hubris lies in the assumption that human engineering can seamlessly step in, uproot an ancient network, shuffle it around like pieces on a chessboard, and somehow improve upon millions of years of natural evolution just by throwing 500,000 kroner at it.
And their version of high-tech engineering was literally building what the sources call an amphibian fence around the construction zone. From what Kesser and Steen observed, this high-tech protective barrier is essentially just a giant scaled-up version of a snail fence.
A snail fence?
Yeah, the kind you would buy at a garden center to keep slugs off your tomatoes. They put up a giant snail fence to keep the highly regulated VIP lizards away from the massive diesel bulldozers.
Which is an incredibly rudimentary and honestly often ineffective way to manage mobile wildlife.
And this brings us to the ultimate observation from our 11-year-old guides. Because Kesser and Steen live right by this area. They are obsessed with nature. And they thought about it logically.
As kids do.
Right. If this luxury hotel was such a massive, beautiful 500,000 kroner success, if the ferry company created the greatest lizard paradise ever known to man, why have the boys never seen a single picture of it?
It is the defining empirical question of the whole ordeal.
Think about corporate PR. If your company spent 500,000 kroner on a highly successful, photogenic eco project, you wouldn't shut up about it.
You'd have it everywhere.
You would have 4K drone footage sweeping over the habitat.
Yeah.
You would have a ribbon-cutting ceremony with the mayor. You'd have a live 24/7 webcam on the company website showing the lizard sunbathing so you could prove how green you are.
But there's nothing.
Nothing. Just empty air, a press release about wet eyes, and a corporate promise that everything is fine. It's like a friend who claims to have an amazing partner who lives in Canada and can never be photographed.
The lack of documentation highlights a core operational truth about these mitigation projects.
Yeah.
The project isn't designed to actually succeed biologically.
Right.
It is designed to succeed bureaucratically. Once the paperwork is stamped, the dispensation is granted, and the ferry company is legally cleared to pour the asphalt well, the actual biological fate of the luxury hotel becomes entirely irrelevant to the people who funded it.
They bought their permission slip.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What happens to the lizards afterward is not their concern.
So, in Shannon's Odd, we see what happens when the grand promises are heavily funded and the project just steamrolls ahead with a smile, a press release, and an IKEA box. But what happens when the protected animals actually manage to stall a massive, profitable project?
Then it gets combative.
Let's look at another case from the sources, moving over to Stevens in March 2024.
This case in the Herjuplen area of Stevens is fascinating because the friction between natural reality and human economic ambition becomes explicitly combative, like you said.
So what was the plan here?
The local authorities had a very ambitious plan to build a massive tourist staircase down a cliff face. It was designed as a public facility for guests to access a scenic area. And additionally, they wanted to convert a closed historical museum building nearby into a hotel.
Oh, so a major economic initiative.
Exactly, meant to drive tourism and revenue for the municipality.
But the local wildlife didn't get the memo about the impending economic boom. The salamanders and the lizards were hanging out right in the middle of the proposed development zone.
Just existing.
Just existing. But by doing so, they were physically blocking the progress of this highly lucrative tourist staircase and the museum hotel.
And here we see the bureaucratic battle lines being formally drawn. The local municipality became incredibly frustrated. The source text specifically notes they were tired of these creatures dictating the agenda.
I love that wording. Tired of the salamanders.
Right. But because of the EU regulations, they couldn't just sweep them away. The Danish Society for Nature Conservation stepped into the fray. They took up the legal fight for the habitat, explicitly invoking those very same strict Annex 4 protections we discussed earlier.
In a shocking twist for anyone cynical about environmental law, the system actually worked.
It did.
The case escalated to the Environmental and Food Board of Appeal. This board looked at the EU rules, looked at the presence of the protected salamanders, and revoked the coastal authorities' dispensation.
A massive victory.
They officially told the municipality, no, you cannot build here. The law protects this habitat. The plans for the tourist staircase and the museum hotel had to be entirely halted.
It is a rare, documented moment of the legislative system functioning exactly as it was designed to by the drafters in Brussels. The VIP legal shield actually held up against the bulldozers.
Right.
But what is truly revealing and deeply concerning is how the local political establishment reacted to this supreme legal defeat.
If you want to understand how deep the rot goes in local planning, just look at the reaction of the political committee in Stevens. The chairman of the Committee for Planning, Environment, and Technology gave an interview reacting to the ruling from the Board of Appeal. And he dismissed the entire legal block as merely a formality.
A formality.
He literally stated to the press that the work was already ongoing, and he fully expected they would find a solution to get the tourist staircase and hotel built anyway, completely regardless of the ruling.
We have to unpack the psychology of that statement. Why do we even have these strict EU registrations, these international Annex 4V protections, if a local politician views a supreme environmental ruling as nothing more than an annoying administrative speed bump?
Let me play devil's advocate again, though. Because if you are a voter in Stevens and your town desperately needs tourism revenue to fund schools and road repairs, aren't you on the politician's side?
From a purely economic standpoint, maybe?
Right, you've already spent public money hiring contractors and drawing up blueprints. Isn't the politician just being pragmatic by trying to save the project from a few salamanders?
The politician is operating on the sunk cost fallacy and economic pragmatism, yes, but that fundamentally undercuts the entire premise of the rule of law.
How so?
If we delve into the mindset of this committee chairman, it reveals a deeply entrenched, dangerous assumption that protected species are just inanimate objects. They aren't viewed as living components of a complex, fragile ecosystem.
They're just items on a checklist?
Exactly. Items on a bureaucratic checklist that you can casually shuffle around or ignore entirely as long as nobody makes too much of a fuss. The dismissal of a supreme environmental ruling as a mere formality signals to developers, contractors, and the public that the law is highly malleable.
That compliance is optional as long as you have enough political capital.
Precisely. It implies that if you have the will, the law doesn't matter.
It brings us right back to the squished fast food burger. The EU writes the law to look like the pristine billboard, but the local politician treats it like the squished, messy reality. He basically says, yeah, Brussels says we have to protect the lizards, but that's just a formality. We've already hired the concrete guys. We'll figure out a loophole.
And this blatant disregard at the political level does not go unnoticed by the public.
Especially not by highly observant kids.
Right. When Kesser and Steen hear about this staggering political arrogance in Stevens, it makes them start deeply questioning the reality of the so-called luxury hotel back in their own neighborhood in Hudjurgskoven.
Because if you think about it logically, if politicians in Stevens openly admit that moving protected animals and ignoring supreme environmental rulings is just a formality to get around, what on earth actually happens to the habitats they promised to build when the media goes home and nobody is looking?
If the law is perceived simply as a hoop to jump through, then the resulting luxury hotel is almost certainly just a cardboard cutout.
Right. So we've seen the politicians brush off the rules from their comfortable climate-controlled council offices. They look at 2D maps and make grand speeches about formalities. Now, we need to follow Kesser and Steen into the actual physical woods to see the ground-level evidence of this environmental hypocrisy.
What happens when the abstract plans meet the dirt?
Let's start with what the sources call the forest loophole.
Yes, this is where the empirical observations of the children provide a devastating contrast to the official narratives.
So in the hills of the boys' neighborhood, there is this large patch of land. And Kesser and Steen overhear the adults, the municipal planners and local officials, making a very strange argument. The adults claim that this area, which is naturally undergoing a process of turning into a forest, is actually bad for the annexed forest and sand lizards.
Bad for them.
Yeah. The adults argue the sand lizards require a light open area with lots of sun.
And Steen's observation, delivered with the sharp clarity only an 11-year-old possesses, cuts right through the bureaucratic nonsense. He says, it's just their excuse to start building.
Smart kid.
Very. We need to unpack the timeline of the municipal logic here because it is a masterclass in administrative hypocrisy. For years, the municipality completely neglected this land. They fell asleep at the wheel, failed to maintain any sort of land management strategy, and allowed the area to naturally undergo ecological succession, slowly turning from scrubland into a forest.
Okay, wait, I need to challenge this again. If the biological textbook literally says that Lacerta agilis needs a light open area to survive, aren't the local planners technically just following the science? How can we blame them for clearing the trees if that's what the EU manual implies the lizards need?
Because they're weaponizing a half-truth. Yes, the lizards need open areas for thermoregulation. But a healthy ecosystem maintains those open patches naturally alongside wooded areas.
Ah, I see.
The hypocrisy lies in the timing and the intent. The municipality didn't care about the lizards for a decade while the forest grew. But now, suddenly, they want to develop the land. They want to lay down infrastructure. So they miraculously rediscover their deep, abiding passion for the Anax futi sand lizard.
Oh no, we must clear this forest purely for the sake of the lizards.
Exactly, to maintain their required habitat. It is a massive self-contradiction. They are using environmental protection laws to justify environmental destruction purely to clear the land for future development.
It is incredibly manipulative. They are using the lizard as a biological scapegoat to get the bulldozers in, assuming that the kids in the nature and innovation class or the general public aren't smart enough to notice the bait and switch.
It is an administrative sleight of hand, and unfortunately, the sheer incompetence doesn't stop at just clearing trees. It extends directly into the physical infrastructure they are forced to build to supposedly protect the wildlife during this new development phase.
If you want to know what a municipality prioritizing speed over science looks like, look at the fauna corridor disaster Kesser and Steen discover.
This is heartbreaking.
It is. The boys are out exploring the edges of a newly built road, and they find a mass of toads and salamanders, a whole migration of them completely trapped on the steep, engineered edge of the asphalt. Why? Because these animals couldn't find the supposed fauna corridor.
To provide context, a fauna corridor is essentially a specially designed wildlife crossing. It is often a tunnel routed under a road intended to connect fragmented habitats. In theory, it allows animals to bypass deadly human infrastructure safely, maintaining access to their breeding ponds.
In theory. But the boys observe that this secret passage is completely useless in reality. The animals literally cannot find the entrance. They're just piling up against a steep drop-off, totally bewildered, physically blocked from reaching their natural water holes.
And that's just the start of it.
Right. Because the absolute peak of this ground-level disaster, the moment that truly shows how broken the system is the story of the toxic tunnels.
This occurred during the construction of a service road around some new townhouses.
Yes. The construction workers are tasked with building these eco-tunnels to act as safe passages for the amphibians and reptiles. To build the tunnel, they use these heavy concrete elements shaped like the Greek letter omega, essentially a large upside-down U shape.
Right.
They lay these heavy concrete arches end-to-end to form the tunnel under the road. But then they encounter a physical problem. There are gaps between the concrete elements that need to be sealed so the soil doesn't wash in. So what do the workers use to seal the seams of this life-saving ecological corridor?
They use a massive amount of industrial joint sealant.
Kesser and Steen actually go down into the ditch and read the discarded tube that the construction workers threw away. The tube literally states in plain, bold text that the sealant is environmentally toxic and absolutely must not be released into nature.
Let's break down the sheer biological catastrophe of this decision. You have a multi-million kroner municipal project, legally mandated by the highest courts in Europe to protect sensitive, highly regulated Annex IV amphibians.
Yep.
And the very infrastructure built to save their lives is literally slathered in chemical poison by the lowest bidding contractor.
How does that even happen? How does an amphibian tunnel get pumped full of poison?
It happens because of the mechanics of municipal procurement. The city planners draw the tunnel on a blueprint to satisfy the EU. But the city doesn't build the tunnel, they hire a general contractor. That contractor hires a subcontractor to do the concrete work.
And the guy laying the concrete.
He has zero ecological training, zero oversight from a biologist, and zero investment in the actual outcome. His only job is to ensure the tunnel doesn't leak soil. He goes to his truck, grabs whatever industrial caulking he has, and fills the gaps. The disconnection between the ecological intent and the physical execution is total.
And the biological impact on the animals is horrifying. We need to talk about how amphibians survive. Frogs, toads, salamanders, they don't drink water like a dog or a human.
Yeah.
They rely on cutaneous respiration.
Exactly. They breathe and absorb moisture directly through their highly permeable skin.
They are essentially walking environmental sponges. They need a damp, wet environment to survive. So inside this dark concrete tunnel, water is going to pool and drip. That water is going to wash constantly over massive globs of environmentally toxic joint sealant. The water itself becomes a chemical solvent.
And when the salamander walks through the tunnel,
It isn't just touching the poison. It is actively absorbing a toxic chemical soup directly into its bloodstream through its skin.
putting a toxic water-soluble chemical inside a damp, enclosed tunnel designed specifically for amphibians is akin to building a hospital ventilation system out of asbestos. It is actively lethal.
Steen's dad has the sharpest, most cynical reaction to this discovery. He suggests that the only way a construction worker could caulk an ecotunnel with toxic glue is if the worker ate way too much oatmeal filled with straw shorteners when he was a kid.
Straw shorteners being a reference to agricultural pesticides heavily used on grain crops to control plant height.
Yeah, he's basically making a dark, sarcastic joke. The only way a human adult could be this profoundly, irreparably disconnected from the basic facts of nature is if their brain chemistry was physically altered by eating pesticides for breakfast.
It's a joke, but it underscores the sheer mind-numbing absurdity of the situation.
It really does. The municipality is patting itself on the back for being green while actively pumping poison into the wildlife corridors.
And this total lack of care is further cemented by the final ground-level discovery Kesser and Steen make, a discovery that perfectly encapsulates the fate of these grand mitigation projects once the media attention fades.
The ruins of the luxury hotel.
Yes.
So the boys are walking near a construction site at Convalvesh. They're looking at a pile of discarded construction, rubble, broken bricks, empty cement bags, twisted rebar, and right in the middle of the trash, they spot something recognizable. It's the top part of a banana-shaped concrete pyramid.
A very specific piece of engineering.
This wasn't just any piece of concrete. This was designed to be the centerpiece of the famous Lizard Luxury Hotel. It was a specially engineered, highly expensive structure meant to provide the lizards with the perfect angles for sunbathing and hiding. And where does it end up? Tossed in the dumpster.
It is the physical, tangible manifestation of a broken bureaucratic promise.
Steen's logic here is razor sharp. He looks at this massive, heavy concrete pyramid top lying in the garbage, and he notes, with perfect deadpan delivery, it can't exactly be the little animals themselves moving rather large concrete slabs around.
A very astute observation. The wildlife did not dismantle their own habitat.
Right. The sand lizards didn't suddenly hit the gym, get incredibly ripped, and decide to renovate their own hotel by hurling the roof into the local landfill.
No, the adults did this.
The contractors did this. They built the PR-friendly luxury item. They checked the box on the EU compliance form. The communications chief shed his wet tears for the cameras. And then, the moment the habitat got in the way of the real construction work, they literally threw it in the garbage.
It is a profound indictment of the entire mitigation system. The laws exist in Brussels, the funds are allocated by the municipality, the press releases are written by the corporate PR teams. But at the absolute ground level, where the concrete meets the soil, the habitat is treated as literal trash.
Now, if you are listening to this, you might be thinking, okay, the contractors are careless and the politicians are greedy, but surely the biologists, the scientists who consult on these projects, surely they know what they are doing, right? Even if the execution is sloppy, the underlying science must be sound.
You would hope so. But as our 11-year-old guides discover, the biological assumptions driving these multi-million kroner projects are often fundamentally embarrassingly flawed.
Which brings us to how the adults are basically rewriting the biology books to suit their construction schedules.
Let's examine what we'll call the segregation myth.
This one is wild.
It is a widely held, very expensive assumption among adult municipal planners and local environmental consultants. The prevailing theory dictated by their models is that sand lizards and salamanders are completely separate entities that require vastly different, isolated environments.
Right.
The bureaucratic model assumes they cannot possibly live in the same area. Therefore, the planners dictate that you must build one specific type of habitat for the reptile and a completely different, physically segregated habitat for the amphibian.
It's literally zoning laws applied to wildlife. Reptiles must reside in Sector A, amphibians are restricted to Sector B. But contrast this official, highly paid biological theory with what Kesser and Steen actually observed with their own eyes on a random Tuesday afternoon in the woods.
The empirical reality completely shatters the sterile bureaucratic model.
So the boys walk into the woods. They see a sand lizard sitting on top of a fallen log, happily sunning itself. They walk over, they physically lift up that exact same log, and what do they find underneath?
A female salamander.
Hanging out with her young in the dirt, completely unbothered by the lizard above her. They are quite literally roommates living on the exact same piece of real estate.
What is fascinating here is how this single observation by two children highlights the immense complexity of microhabitats, a complexity that 2D municipal mapping entirely misses.
It's just a line on a map to them.
Exactly. Let's explain the science of that log. To a city planner looking at a spreadsheet, a log is just a piece of debris. But ecologically, it is a multi-story ecosystem. The top of the log provides a dry, exposed, light-open basking area. This is absolutely necessary for the cold-blooded sand lizard to absorb solar radiation and thermoregulate its body temperature.
Right. The lizard needs the penthouse suite for the sun.
Exactly. But the underside of that very same log provides a dark, cool, highly damp environment. The wood traps the soil moisture, preventing evaporation. This is absolutely necessary for the amphibian to prevent desiccation drying out and to protect its permeable skin.
Wow.
They occupy completely different microniches within 4 inches of each other.
It is an ecological bunk bed. The lizard is on top, catching rays, the salamander's on the bottom, staying moist, and yet the adult planners are spending fortunes trying to separate them based on flawed textbooks. I mean, if you were listening to this and you work in municipal funding, you should probably call customer service and demand a refund on those biology books, because two 11-year-olds flipping over a single piece of wood just completely debunk your entire expensive zoning strategy.
It demonstrates the inherent danger of abstracting the natural world into spreadsheets and rigid categories. Nature does not compartmentalize itself the way human bureaucracies do, and this deep misunderstanding extends to an even more damaging systemic myth, the myth of the stationary amphibian.
Oh, this one is genuinely tragic when you see the results. There seems to be this ongoing assumption among the planners about how these animals move through the world. The adults seem to operate under the belief that an amphibian like a cod or a salamander is born in a specific pond, and it basically just stays within a few feet of that pond for its entire life.
Like it's tethered to the water hole by an invisible leash.
Yes. It is an incredibly convenient assumption for developers. Think about it from a zoning perspective. If the biological model says the animals never leave the pond, you only have to legally protect the pond itself. You can build roads, hotels, tourist staircases, and parking lots all around it as long as you leave a tidy little 10-meter buffer zone around the water's edge. It maximizes the buildable land.
But once again, Kesser and Steen's grim daily reality proves the adults completely fatally wrong. Because the boys don't just see salamanders at the edge of the pond. They find them absolutely everywhere.
Everywhere.
The scope of amphibian wandering is extraordinary and completely unaccounted for in local planning.
The boys find salamanders hiding in damp, dark residential basements. They find them crawled up on windowsills of houses. They find them trekking out in the middle of open agricultural fields. They find them deep in the surrounding woods. And most tragically and frequently, they find them out on the newly built roads, completely flattened like a slice of pizza by passing cars.
The flattened pizza imagery is brutal, but it perfectly illustrates the conflict between human infrastructure and biological imperative. These animals are incredibly mobile.
Right.
The source material highlights a specific, staggering biological fact. A seemingly small, slow-moving salamander can actually wander up to 850 meters from its breeding pond.
850 meters. Let's put that in perspective. That is over half a mile. For a creature that is maybe 4 to 6 inches long with tiny little legs, that is an epic, massive journey. That's the equivalent of a human deciding to walk across an entire continent just to find a partner. Why are they walking that far?
That journey is not an accident. It is a vital biological necessity. They are wandering across these massive distances to forage for specific invertebrates, to find deep, frost-free winter hibernation spots, and most importantly, to find a mate from a different genetic pool and establish new families.
So they have to move.
They do. When you realize that their natural required range is nearly a 1-kilometer radius, the bureaucratic idea of just protecting the central pond and putting up a luxury hotel fence around it becomes entirely absurd. You aren't protecting their habitat, you are turning their habitat into a prison.
And the adults building these projects are completely blind to this movement. Let's talk about the sheer invisibility of these animals during active construction.
This is where it gets incredibly frustrating.
The developers put up their little snail fences. They lay down massive, incredibly heavy iron plates for the excavators and bulldozers to drive on, and they assume the area is cleared and safe. But Steen, because he is actually looking at the dirt, not a blueprint, notices what is really happening.
The animals don't magically disappear when the tractors arrive. They simply adapt to the terrifying new architecture.
Right. Steen observes that the salamanders and lizards are just crawling under the massive iron plates. They are hiding in the microscopic crevices between the heavy machinery plates and the compacted dirt. They are literally living right under the treads of the multi-ton excavators.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is a profound tragedy of scale. The adults, sitting in the cabs of these massive machines, looking at their high-level architectural blueprints, simply cannot physically see what is happening inches beneath their wheels. The micro-reality of the ecosystem is entirely invisible to the macro-mechanics of human construction.
Out of sight, out of mind.
They assume the land is empty because they can't see the life from their vantage point.
And the most infuriating part is, They actively refuse to listen when confronted with the truth. You have Kesser and Steen, these highly observant kids, standing right there saying, hey, stop! The animals are under the plates, they're wandering across the road, they're living under the same log, but the adults dismiss them.
They won't hear it.
They completely ignore the empirical evidence presented by a couple of 11-year-olds because acknowledging that truth would contradict the expensive, officially approved plan.
It is the ultimate arrogant folly. The adults are ignoring hard physical data simply because it doesn't align with the clean, bureaucratic narrative they sold to the EU.
Now, if you were listening to this, you might be thinking, okay, this is sad. A few salamanders get squished, a concrete pyramid gets thrown away, the politicians are arrogant, it's a bummer. But this isn't just a quirky local story about confused planners.
No, the stakes are much higher.
This stubborn refusal to understand how animals actually move and live has devastating, permanent, existential consequences for the species as a whole. And that brings us to the most serious, critical part of our deep dive. We need to talk about why the map is not the territory.
This is where we must shift from the localized absurdities of toxic glue and IKEA boxes to the macro-ecological disaster that this kind of bureaucratic planning inevitably creates. We need to deeply examine the concept of the gene pool because this is where the true damage of these mitigation projects occurs.
Let's unpack the biological mechanics here. For anyone who hasn't taken a biology class in a while, why is the gene pool the absolute critical factor?
A gene pool represents the total genetic diversity found within a specific population or an entire species. In evolutionary biology, genetic diversity is the absolute key to long-term survival. It provides the population with resilience against novel diseases, changing environmental conditions, and the manifestation of genetic defects.
Okay, so it's their defense system.
Precisely. Now remember that incredible 850-meter journey the salamander takes. That wandering is not just a hike. It is the physical mechanism by which genetic diversity is maintained. Animals from one pond travel vast distances to mate with animals from another pond, constantly mixing, refreshing, and strengthening the genetic lines.
So the wandering is basically a giant, slow-moving, biological networking event. It keeps the bloodlines fresh.
Exactly. But what happens when human developers impose their flawed 2D models onto this dynamic landscape? When a municipality locks animals in at a single water hole using plastic amphibian fences, or when they lock them out of a massive construction site for years at a time while a road is built, they are doing much more than just altering the landscape.
They're breaking the network.
They are physically severing the genetic network.
They're essentially creating isolated, disconnected islands of animals.
And in ecology, forced isolation is a slow death sentence. When a small population of amphibians is permanently trapped in one luxury hotel or one isolated pond, they are eventually forced to inbreed. They mate with siblings and cousins. Over generations, which for amphibians can pass relatively quickly, the genetic diversity plummets.
Oh, wow.
This leads to what biologists call inbreeding depression. Recessive lethal genetic traits begin to manifest. Their immune systems weaken. Their reproductive success drops. Eventually, a localized disease or a slight change in climate that a diverse population could easily survive will sweep through and wipe them out entirely.
That is incredibly grim.
By trying to protect them in highly contained, segregated zones based on flawed mapping, the municipality is slowly, mathematically strangling the species out of existence.
It's an extinction vortex created by paperwork.
Yeah.
And we actually have a massive documented precedent for this exact phenomenon mentioned in the sources, a broader example of how human infrastructure actively destroys genetic networks, even when we spend millions trying to help.
Yeah.
We have to talk about the highway badger precedent.
Yes, the large highway project. This is a perfect, tragic illustration of the map versus territory problem on a massive scale. In this instance, planners were building a massive new highway that bisected a known wildlife habitat.
Right.
But wanting to be environmentally responsible and fully comply with the regulations, they spent millions of kroner constructing dedicated fauna corridors specifically designed for the local badger populations. They engineered large concrete tunnels under the asphalt, meticulously designed to let the badgers cross safely from one side of the highway to the other.
On paper, in the planning office, this is a massive success. The billboard burger looks incredible. The politicians can say, we built a vital new highway and we saved the badgers. We are environmental heroes.
But the physical reality on the ground, the actual territory, was entirely different. Despite the existence of these highly expensive corridors, the badgers simply didn't use them the way the human engineers predicted.
Why not?
Badgers navigate their territory using complex acoustic and olfactory cues, scent trails. The concrete tunnels, filled with the echoing noise of overhead traffic and the unnatural smell of exhaust and joint sealant, disrupted their natural senses. The natural crossing patterns were utterly, permanently disrupted.
And what was the long-term biological result of the badgers refusing to use the human-engineered tunnels?
The biological data collected years later revealed a catastrophe. The once single, unified badger gene pool in that entire area ended up completely split. The highway acted as an impenetrable genetic wall. The planners permanently created two distinct genetically isolated groups, an East family and a West family, entirely divided by the asphalt.
Wow.
The infrastructure permanently fractured the species' evolutionary path in that region, setting both isolated populations on a path toward inbreeding depression.
Because, as it turns out, animals simply do not read the maps humans draw. I mean, it sounds so incredibly obvious when you say it out loud. A badger cannot look at a municipal zoning map, see a dotted line indicating an officially approved fauna corridor, and say to itself, "Ah, yes, the legally compliant crossing zone is 400 meters to the north. Let me adjust my ancestral migration route to satisfy the town council."
It highlights the core philosophical disconnect of our entire modern environmental planning system. Politicians, engineers, and bureaucrats sit in cozy, brightly lit conference rooms in city halls or in Brussels. They look at two-dimensional maps on screens. They draw lines, they designate zones, they calculate square footage for luxury hotels, and they argue over budgets.
Yeah, they're playing SimCity.
They build a perfectly logical, legally compliant, sterile universe on paper. And they operate on the breathtakingly arrogant assumption that the messy, ancient, complex, 3D reality of nature will simply fall in line and comply with their human bureaucracy.
They truly expect nature to behave like an obedient, salaried employee. We gave you an expensive concrete tunnel, so use it. We built you a banana pyramid, so sit on it. We gave you an IKEA box, be grateful.
Precisely. And when nature inevitably does not comply, when the salamanders wander 850 meters to get squished on the new road, when the lizards share a log with the amphibians instead of staying in their designated zones, when the badgers refuse to enter the concrete pipes because they smell like exhaust, the planners do not adjust their maps.
No, they don't.
They do not rewrite the biology books. They just seal the concrete with toxic glue, file the paperwork, and claim the project was a resounding environmental success because the compliance forms were stamped.
Which leads us to the ultimate, unavoidable question derived from everything Kesser and Steen have observed in the dirt. If the fauna corridors don't work, if the ecotunnels are actively pumped full of toxic poison, if the multi-million kroner luxury habitats are literally dumped in the construction trash, and if the gene pools of these highly protected species are being permanently split and destroyed, who is this entire system actually benefiting?
It is a damning question to ask, but a necessary one.
It certainly isn't benefiting nature. Nature is getting paved over, poisoned, and genetically isolated. The sand lizards are not throwing a party in their IKEA boxes. The salamanders are not celebrating their new toxic slip and slide. So who is the actual winner here? Who benefits from this charade?
If we follow the logic, the bureaucracy, and most importantly the money, the beneficiaries are entirely human. It benefits the politicians who get to cut a green ribbon, shed a tear for the cameras, and claim they are environmentally conscious while delivering economic growth. It benefits the developers, the ferry companies, and the hoteliers who get to clear the legal hurdles necessary to build their highly profitable infrastructure. It benefits the contractors who get paid millions of public kroners to pour concrete pyramids and build useless snail fences.
It's an industry.
The entire apparatus of environmental mitigation in these ground-level instances has been completely hollowed out. It is no longer about preserving ecology. It is about sustaining the lucrative economy of compliance.
It is an incredibly cynical yet entirely factual physical reality. And as we move toward wrapping up this deep dive, I want to pull all of this together through the incredibly clear, uncompromised eyes of our two 11-year-old guides, Kesser and Steen.
Summarizing the journey they have taken us on, from the grand laws to the toxic glue.
Exactly. We started by looking up at the grand, sweeping European Union directives, the Annex 4 registrations. On paper, at the highest legislative levels of government in Brussels, these laws look beautiful. They represent humanity at its best, recognizing the intrinsic value of vulnerable species and vowing to protect them at all costs from unchecked development. It is the flawless, towering billboard burger.
But the descent from European ideals to municipal reality is incredibly steep and treacherous.
When those strict laws trickle down to local implementation, down to the ferry roads in Jellin's Odd, or the tourist staircases in Stevens, or the housing developments in the Boys' Own neighborhood, they mutate. They completely stop being ecological shields. They turn into a mix of annoying formalities for arrogant local politicians, lucrative box-checking contracts for construction companies, and a toxic, confusing, deadly mess for the animals themselves.
The mitigation efforts, the luxury hotels, the fauna corridors, the amphibian fences, are ultimately revealed to be largely performative. They are architectural theater, designed to placate the law and soothe the public conscience, while the real business of paving the earth continues uninterrupted.
And the sharpest observation, the most biting, sarcastic truth that we can pull from the source material and from these boys' experiences is how we currently define the word green in municipal planning. When the municipality, the politicians, and the developers hold press conferences talking about being green, Kesser and Steen have realized they aren't actually talking about nature. They aren't talking about the trees or the wandering salamanders or the delicate ancient balance of the gene pool.
No, they are talking about something much more tangible and immediately valuable to them.
They're mostly just talking about the color of the banknotes, the massive amounts of money that flow through these infrastructure projects, lubricated by the illusion of environmental compliance. It is greenwashing its most literal, physical form, painting toxic concrete tunnels with the brush of eco-friendliness.
It is a sobering realization, but an essential one if we are ever going to demand systems that actually protect the natural world, rather than systems that just generate lucrative, meaningless paperwork about protecting it.
So as we end this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. Something to carry with you the next time you walk or drive through your own town. The next time you see a polished, beautifully photographed, incredibly expensive, eco-friendly public works project in your city. Maybe it's a new greenway bypass, a heavily advertised wildlife crossing, or a massive corporate park with a dedicated fenced-off nature zone. I want you to stop and ask yourself, if an 11-year-old like Steen or Kesser walked past the PR signs, stepped onto that site, and flipped over the proverbial log, what would they actually find underneath?
Would they find a thriving, integrated, biologically sound ecosystem?
Or would they find toxic glue oozing from the concrete joints? Would they find squished pizza salamanders on the nearby access road because the animals couldn't find the multi-million-dollar tunnel? Would they find discarded promises and broken concrete pyramids hidden in the construction rubble? We have to seriously ask ourselves, are we actually saving nature? Or are we just building fake luxury hotels to make ourselves feel better while we bulldoze the woods? Out there in the dirt, the truth isn't written on a perfectly clean billboard or a stamped compliance form. The truth is whatever is currently surviving, against all odds, under the heavy iron plates of our own so-called progress.